Dollar General. Chapter 8. A money gym, accounting gym. Gyms from gyms, Jimly got gymmed into a gym. Gym where no gyms or gym, but gym enough gyms in the gym to gym all of gym. And Jim the Jimmel, Jimmick, Jimry, Jimny, gymmed gyms that Jim are. Jim started gymming. Jim gymmed it, Jimmer? Jim a gym, because Jim don't gym. Jim, wanna gym a gimmick Jim? The Jim said. Jim do, said Red Jim. Jim Jime, a Jim. Gold Jim, Jimly, Jimming Jim. Jim, well Jim have a Jim. Jimmy Jimly said, Jim of Jimly gymming at half Jim. Half Jim, Jim's Jim, Jimly gymmed. Jim's got a Jim of Jim. Jim and Jim gymmed at Leather Jim and Jimson. Jim have old Jim. Get Jim? Bad Jim at the Slimy Jim. Jim's old Jimmy Jimily, and Jim are Jim. Prince Jim gymmed gymming to his Jim. Jimfully, Mad Jim, gymmed Jim. The Jim isn't Jim to Jimmy Jim, a Jim young Jim. Jim gyms the Jim to Jim. Jim gymmed at Jim at Dark Jim. Jim must gym. Jim is gymming Jim of Jim. Robo Jim to Trash Jim. Nude Dak, O Poochie E. Jim's the forehead Jimmer. Jim thinks Jim gymmed. Did Jim gym at the Jim? Orange Jim gymmed, really gymming some Jim. Jim gyms a durational Jim and Jimmer. Scarf Jim gymmed as the Jim was Jimly gymming. Jim Doggo Jim is gymming to Jim. Gymming at the Jimly. The Jim gymmed. Four bird Jims gymmed in. Jim of Jim gymming. Jim, where Jim? Jim E3. The Jim gymmed. The Jim was Jimmered, gymming back into Jim. If Jim gymmed, Jimly Jim could gym the Jim of Jim gyms gymming in the J-I-M. Gyms all have gyms. The perpetually gymming Jimwa. Jim good Jim to the Jimette of the Jim. So Jim gymming. Short Jim gymmed Jimly gymming to a Jim of all Jim and all of Jim. Jim, are you gymming Jim? The ever gymmed music Jim. And the drum gymmed. Just gymmed because of Jims have to Jim. Jim don't gymming Jim. Jim amazing Jim gymming on a Jimmiest not emo Jim. Jim are Jimmers. Monkey Jim gymmed gymming on a Jim. Jim a Jiminy. Fire Jim gymmed. Jimdily gymming for a Jim to Jim. Jim got coat Jim. The Jim gymmed. Jim was in a Jim's gymped Jim. Jim can jime Jimmel. The Doc Jim Jimly gymmed as to why Jim was jiming. Jimmissable. Jimst all of the Jims jimed. And the jime to Jim as Jimmel do Jim and Jim. Jim am weed Jim. Jim of Jim. Nerd Jim gymmed to gymped. Jim to Jim gymming when Jim gymped gymming a Jim gymming to Jim. And Jim a Jim no Jim than 12, which Jim has not gymmed. Jim and Jim are Jim? Jim asked. Jim little Jim, and Jim have Jim of Jim. Finger Jim gymmed in the Jim. Under gymming the Jimmers. Jim gymmed and Jimful Jiminition. Jim have Jims, Jim, and Jimny, Jim, the Jimmer. Jim gyms, and Jim to Jim up Jim. And that's how Jim was gymmed. The Dollar General employee held her face in her hands. Fighting through the Jim caused headache. That's nice. Will working Jim take Jim story to Jim to other Jims? Jimly Jim on Jim? We are not a library, the employee sternly explained. You cannot just give us a book and expect it to be sold. Copyright would be a thorn, if anything. Cause most of these gems are other people. You can't just Jimify them. Jim wilted. Jim under Jim's Jim go Jim. The employee muttered as she watches the strange man walk out the door. I didn't think void creatures could get headaches. I didn't think there was anything weirder either. Author-san and Author-sama would like to note that there are 365 gyms in the story, one for each day, except leap years, the traders. If you want to read the non-gymified version, ask, and we'll send it to you. The story's name is Characters from Several Fandoms Randomly Got Sucked into a Locked Room. It's on AO3 and Wattpad. We had to black out the words so we couldn't read it. If we read it, we couldn't write anymore because of Jim. If you manage to read the entire thing out loud without laughing, you get an internet